They called us Deathworlders. And then we proved why the Galactic Council's emergency session convened with the grave solemnity that only a collection of 17 wildly different species could muster. Delegates settled into their environmentally customized pods, some filled with methane, others with exotic noble gas mixtures, a few with nutrient-rich liquid solutions. Overhead, the massive crystalline dome of High Station Concordia revealed the spectacular view of 3 neighboring galaxies, their spiraling arms, a cosmic backdrop to proceedings that would determine the fate of yet another potential member species. "I move that we address the human question without further delay," announced High Admiral Vexilloran, his gill flaps pulsating with agitation. The aquatic Massyrian's sleek exoskeletal frame gleamed under the council lights as he gestured, with one of his 4 primary manipulators toward the holographic display at the center of the chamber. "The data is conclusive. They are, without question, Deathworlders of the highest order." The term hung in the chamber like a toxic gas cloud. Deathworlders, species that evolved on planets that should, by all reasonable scientific metrics, have killed them thousands of times over. Species whose very physiological makeup was forged in environments so hostile that most council races couldn't survive on their planets for more than a few minutes without extensive life support. "Surely the classification is premature," countered Ambassador Zrill, the hive mind representative of the Phylaxian commune. Zrill's 7 identical bodies spoke in perfect harmony, their chitinous exoskeletons clicking softly as they moved in perfect synchrony. "We have only observed 1 human specimen thus far." The hologram at the center of the room shifted, displaying the subject in question, a human male designated Kyle Matthews, currently being held in what the council euphemistically called adaptive quarantine, but what was essentially a glorified zoo exhibit 2 levels below. "1 specimen is sufficient," replied Grand Observer Talaxu, the ancient Varelian's voice wheezing through respiratory filters. His species' methane-based biology required constant atmospheric support outside their home system, and the elaborate apparatus surrounding his hovering platform hummed continuously. "Review the evidence. The human survived 3 different standardized environmental tests that should have been fatal. Its endoskeleton is reinforced with calcium deposits. Its epidermis continuously regenerates. It requires regular hydration, yet can survive significant dehydration periods. Most disturbing, it produces internal acid as part of its digestive process." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the assembly. Several of the more sensitive delegates visibly recoiled. "And let us not forget," Vexilloran continued, "the human's home planet, Earth, a Class 4 death world with extreme temperature variations, constant geological instability, atmospheric oxygen levels that would be combustible by Minervian standards, solar radiation exposure that would sterilize half the species in this chamber, and apex predators that evolved specifically to kill beings of the human's approximate size and composition." The hologram shifted again, displaying images of Earth's most terrifying natural phenomena: hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, lightning storms, and predators with concerning numbers of teeth. "Yet they survive," Talaxu wheezed. "Not merely survive, they thrive. Their cities sprawl across tectonic fault lines. They build dwellings in floodplains. They deliberately expose themselves to solar radiation for aesthetic purposes. And perhaps, most disturbing of all, they consume other life forms, not just plant matter but the actual muscle tissue of other sentient species from their planet." Several delegates excused themselves hastily at this statement. Ambassador Zrill's central body raised an appendage in objection. "The definition of sentience is hardly applicable to most Earth species they consume, according to our standards." "That is hardly reassuring," interrupted Vexilloran. "Have you seen what they consider entertainment? Their fiction consistently depicts scenarios of extreme violence, planetary destruction, and interspecies conflict. Their entire history is a succession of increasingly efficient methods of killing one another, and now they have achieved basic interstellar capability. The risk is unacceptable." The hologram shifted again, showing Kyle Matthews sitting calmly in his containment chamber, seemingly unperturbed as he flipped through a primitive data tablet the council had allowed him to keep. The human appeared surprisingly ordinary, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, with patches of keratin filaments on specific parts of his epidermis. Nothing about his appearance suggested the terrifying durability and adaptability that had thrown the Galactic Council into such disarray. The grand arbiter of the council, a gaseous collective intelligence known as the Mist, expanded slightly in its containment field, the traditional signal for attention. When the Mist spoke, its voice emanated from all corners of the chamber simultaneously. "We shall interview the specimen directly. Bring the human before us." Meanwhile, in his adaptive quarantine cell, Kyle Matthews was thoroughly enjoying his second cup of what the aliens had analyzed and determined was not immediately lethal coffee. The beverage had passed through no fewer than 17 different scanning procedures before being approved for his consumption. Kyle found this hilarious given that the coffee was made from his own personal supply that he'd had in his ship when they'd picked him up. "Another beautiful day in space jail," Kyle muttered to himself, scrolling through old photos on his tablet. He'd been in containment for approximately 3 Earth weeks by his calculation, ever since his small exploration vessel had been intercepted near what turned out to be a major alien transit hub. As first contact scenarios went, it wasn't exactly the triumphant moment humanity had imagined. No grand speeches about peaceful cooperation, no ceremonial exchange of gifts. Just Kyle, his modest ship, and a lot of very panicked alien vessels surrounding him with weapons that made nuclear arsenals look like water pistols. His cell was comfortable enough. Temperature regulated to Earth norms, standard gravity, breathable atmosphere. The aliens had even tried to recreate Earth-like furnishings, though everything was slightly off in ways that suggested they were working from technical specifications rather than actual experience. His bed, for instance, was perfectly rectangular, with absolutely no give to the mattress, as if someone had read, "Humans sleep on raised platforms with cushioned surfaces," and interpreted it in the most literal possible way. The door to his cell hissed open, revealing 3 aliens of different species. Kyle had started mentally categorizing them by their most obvious features. The one in front he called Fish Face, a tall, sleek being with gill-like structures and iridescent scales. Behind stood Bug Colony, 7 identical insectoid creatures that moved in perfect synchrony. And finally, Gas Bag, a hovering platform containing what appeared to be a sentient cloud inside a transparent container. "The human will accompany us to the council chamber," announced Fishface in the curiously accentless English that their translation technology produced. Kyle closed his tablet and stood up, stretching dramatically. "Finally, the VIP tour. I was beginning to think I'd been forgotten." The aliens exchanged what Kyle assumed were confused glances, though it was hard to tell with Bug Colony and completely impossible with Gasbag. "You have not been forgotten," Bug Colony replied, all 7 mouths moving in perfect unison, which Kyle still found deeply unsettling. "Your presence and potential threat assessment have been the Council's primary concern since your arrival." "Threat assessment?" Kyle raised his eyebrows. "I'm one guy in a ship barely bigger than a delivery truck. What exactly am I threatening?" None of the aliens answered as they escorted him through the gleaming corridors of what Kyle had determined was some kind of massive space station. The architecture was both beautiful and disorienting. Ceilings that curved in non-Euclidean patterns, light sources that seemed to emanate from nowhere in particular, and occasional sections where gravity shifted subtly for no apparent reason. Kyle had spent his confinement period theorizing that the station had been designed to accommodate so many different species that it had ended up feeling slightly wrong to all of them. As they approached the council chamber, Kyle squared his shoulders and put on his best diplomat face. His actual mission parameters hadn't included first contact. He'd been charting a new potential transit route when he'd accidentally stumbled across the alien hub, but he'd had the standard diplomatic training that all exploration pilots received. Most of it boiled down to don't offend anyone, don't make promises you can't keep, and try not to start an interstellar incident. The doors to the council chamber opened to reveal a vast, dome-ceilinged room filled with the most diverse collection of alien life forms Kyle had ever imagined. Some were vaguely humanoid, Others resembled nothing he'd ever seen before. Crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light, writhing masses of tentacles, beings that seemed to phase in and out of visibility. Each occupied their own specialized environmental pod, and all of them were staring directly at him. "Well," Kyle said under his breath, "no pressure." The humans stood before them with what the Council's behavioral analysts identified as concerning calm. According to their extensive research into Earth species, most organisms placed in front of a gathering of apex predators should display visible stress responses. The humans showed none. In fact, if the analysts were interpreting correctly, the slight curvature of the human's mouth indicated what their species called amusement. "Kyle Matthews of Earth," intoned the mist, the translation systems converting its gaseous fluctuations into sounds the human could comprehend. "You stand before the Galactic Council as the first documented representative of your species to make contact with the greater galactic community." Kyle nodded. A gesture that the Council had studied and determined indicated acknowledgement. "It's an honor to be here," he replied. "Though I have to say, the accommodations could use some work. The toilet situation is especially creative." Several Council members exchanged the equivalent of confused glances. The humans' reference to waste elimination facilities seemed inappropriate for such a formal setting. Vex-Loren leaned forward in his hydration chamber. "Human Matthews, perhaps you fail to grasp the gravity of your situation. Your species has been provisionally classified as Class 4 Deathworlders. Do you understand what this means?" Kyle shrugged. Another human gesture that the analysts struggled to precisely categorize. "Not really. I'm guessing it's not a compliment, though." "It means," Talaxu wheezed through his respirators, "that your species evolved on a planet so hostile, so fundamentally dangerous, that by all reasonable metrics you should not exist. Your continued survival defies probability." "Huh," Kyle replied, scratching his head. "Earth seems pretty nice to me. I mean, sure, we have hurricanes and earthquakes, but it's not like the whole planet is trying to kill us." "Your planet has multiple massive tectonic plates in constant collision," countered one of the Zrill bodies. "Your atmosphere is 21% oxygen, a level considered explosive in many Council systems. Your world experiences regular bombardment by space debris. Your oceans, which cover 71% of your surface, regularly produce waves capable of destroying coastal settlements. Your weather systems include phenomena that can level entire cities. And that's before we consider the biological hazards," added a crystalline being that Kyle hadn't been introduced to. "Your planet contains over 10 million distinct species, a statistically improbable number of which are venomous, poisonous, or otherwise lethal. You coexist with microscopic organisms that continuously attempt to colonize your bodies. You have evolved to consume substances that would be considered toxic waste on most Council worlds." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "When you put it that way, Earth does sound pretty metal." The translation systems briefly faltered at the idiom before a secondary algorithm provided context. "We have conducted analysis of your physical form," continued Vex-Loren. "Your species can survive temperature ranges that would kill most Council races. You can withstand gravitational forces that would crush many of us. You can recover from physical injuries that would be fatal to others. Most disturbing of all, you appear to have evolved to deliberately seek out risk, danger, and the unknown." Kyle couldn't help smiling now. "So basically, you're saying humans are Space Orcs?" The Council chamber fell silent, the translation systems completely failing to process the reference. "It's an internet thing," Kyle explained, which only deepened the confusion. "Look, I get that Earth might be a bit rough compared to your home worlds, but that doesn't make us dangerous to you. I'm just an explorer. My species is curious, that's all." "Curiosity," rumbled a massive being composed of what appeared to be living stone, "is precisely what concerns us. Your kind has progressed from primitive tool use to rudimentary space travel in an evolutionary eye blink. Your technological development curve is nearly vertical, and throughout your history, your first response to discovering new territories Resources or species has consistently been to claim, consume, or conquer them. Kyle's expression grew more serious. That's a pretty reductive view of human history. We've made plenty of mistakes, sure, but we've learned from them. We've developed ethics, laws, environmental protection. Only after causing near irreversible damage, interrupted Tlaxu. And always too late for those already harmed. The mist expanded slightly, drawing attention back to itself. The question before this council is not whether humans have the potential for peaceful cooperation. The question is whether the risk of introducing Deathworlders into the galactic community outweighs the potential benefits. Kyle looked around the chamber, suddenly realizing the full implications of this hearing. Wait, are you actually considering quarantining Earth? Preventing us from joining the galactic community? That would be the most minimal intervention under consideration, replied Vexilloran with unsettling calm. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. And the maximum intervention? The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. 3 days later, Kyle found himself back in his containment cell, albeit with significantly enhanced security measures. The council's deliberations continued, but he had been removed from the proceedings after what the aliens euphemistically called an emotional display, but what Kyle would have described as justifiable outrage upon learning that genocide was on the table. His meals now arrived via automated delivery system, rather than being brought by the various alien attendants he'd started to build rapport with. His tablet's communication capabilities, limited as they were, had been further restricted. Even the window-like screen that had previously shown him views of the spectacular space station exterior had been deactivated, leaving only blank walls. Kyle paced his cell, mind racing. His diplomatic training had covered first contact protocols, cultural sensitivity, even basic negotiation tactics. It had not, however, included a section on what to do when a council of advanced aliens considers your entire species too dangerous to live. The worst part was that he couldn't even warn Earth. His ship's communication systems didn't have the range to reach home, and the aliens had impounded his vessel immediately upon his arrival. For all anyone on Earth knew, he'd simply disappeared on a routine mapping mission, one of the accepted risks of deep space exploration. The cell door hissed open, interrupting his thoughts. To his surprise, it wasn't the usual security detail, but a single member of the Phylaxian commune, one of the 7 identical insectoid bodies that collectively formed Ambassador Zrill. "You should not be here," Kyle said, eyeing the alien suspiciously. "An accurate observation," replied the Phylaxian, its mandibles clicking softly. "The council remains in closed session. I have temporarily separated from my other aspects to speak with you privately." "Is that even possible? I thought your species was a hive mind." "A common misconception. We are a collective consciousness with distributed processing capabilities. Brief individuation is possible, though disorienting." The insectoid being's compound eyes gleamed in the cell's light. "I have reviewed the historical and biological data on humans more thoroughly than my colleagues. I find the consensus forming within the council troubling." Kyle felt a flicker of hope. "So you don't think we're murderous space monsters?" "I think you are precisely what the evidence suggests. Dangerous, adaptable, and unpredictable. But I also think extinction or permanent quarantine represents a failure of imagination." The Phylaxian moved further into the cell, its chitinous exoskeleton making soft clicking sounds. "The council fears what it does not understand, and humans are particularly difficult to understand." "We're really not that complicated," Kyle protested. "We just want to explore, learn, connect with others, while simultaneously preparing for conflict at every opportunity," the Phylaxian interjected. "Your exploration vessels contain weapons. Your greeting messages include warnings. Even now imprisoned and alone, you are actively seeking escape routes and advantages." It gestured toward the small pile of objects Kyle had been collecting. Near his bed, items that could, with some imagination, be repurposed as tools or weapons. Kyle didn't bother denying it. "Self-preservation isn't a crime." "It is, however, revealing," replied the alien. Most species would respond to this situation with despair or resignation. You respond with planning and adaptation. This is both why humans are feared and why I believe extermination would be a grave mistake. I'm glad someone sees it that way, Kyle said cautiously. So what are you proposing? The Phylaxian's mandibles clicked rapidly, what Kyle had come to recognize as their version of hesitation. The Council has scheduled a final test of human capabilities and threat assessment. They believe it will confirm their worst fears. I believe it presents an opportunity. What kind of test? You will be placed in an artificially constructed scenario designed to evaluate human response to extreme stress and conflict. The parameters are being finalized now. Kyle frowned. So, what? I'm supposed to prove humans aren't dangerous by performing well in what sounds like a combat simulation? The contradiction has not escaped my notice, the Phylaxian replied. And Kyle could have sworn he detected a note of dry humor in the alien's mechanically translated voice. But Council protocols demand empirical evidence. The test is your only remaining opportunity to influence their decision. And if I refuse? Then the Council will proceed with its deliberations using the data already available, which overwhelmingly supports classification of humans as an extinction-level threat to galactic stability. Kyle sat down heavily on his too-firm bed. Not much of a choice, is it? Choice is often illusory even in optimal circumstances. The Phylaxian moved toward the door. I must return to my collective before my absence is noted. The test will commence tomorrow at what you would consider dawn. I suggest you rest. Wait, Kyle called as the alien reached the doorway. Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this? The Phylaxian paused, its compound eyes glittering. The Phylaxian commune once faced similar judgment from the Council. We were considered too dangerous, too different, too unpredictable. A single advocate argued that our unique perspective might bring value to the galactic community. That advocate was correct. I merely extend the same consideration. With that, the insectoid being slipped out, leaving Kyle alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that the fate of humanity might rest on whatever test awaited him tomorrow. Kyle was escorted from his cell before he'd even finished. The strange purple nutrient paste the aliens provided as breakfast. His security detail consisted of 4 different species, all wearing what appeared to be environmental protection suits, as if proximity to a human might somehow contaminate them. So where are we headed? Kyle asked cheerfully, deciding that appearing relaxed and unthreatening was his best strategy. Test chamber? Gladiatorial arena? Reality TV studio? None of the aliens responded. Kyle had noticed that most of the station's inhabitants had become increasingly reluctant to engage with him in any way, as if his Deathworlder status might be contagious. Only the Council members and designated researchers still spoke to him directly. They led him through unfamiliar corridors into a section of the station he hadn't visited before. The architecture here was more utilitarian, lacking the aesthetic flourishes of the public and diplomatic areas. Eventually, they reached a large circular chamber with a featureless door on the opposite side. The security team positioned themselves at the entrance, and a moment later, a holographic projection of Vex Loran appeared in the center of the room. Human Matthews, the aquatic alien, began without preamble. You have been designated the subject of Survival Scenario Assessment Protocol 7 Alpha. This is a standard procedure for evaluating potentially dangerous species. Funny, I don't remember signing up for this, Kyle replied, crossing his arms. Vexaloran's gill flaps pulsated in what Kyle had learned was an expression of irritation. Your consent is not required under Council Emergency Powers Statute 359. The assessment will proceed regardless of your cooperation, though non-cooperation will be noted and factored into the final determination regarding your species. Kyle sighed. Fine, what do I have to do? Fight some alien monster, solve impossible puzzles, cook a souffle under pressure? The scenario parameters are simple, Vexaloran continued, ignoring Kyle's sarcasm. You will be placed in an environment designed to simulate extreme conditions. Your objective is survival. How you achieve this objective will provide valuable data on human problem-solving, adaptability, and threat potential. That's pretty vague, Kyle pointed out. What kind of extreme conditions are we talking about? Revealing such details would compromise the assessment. Vexilloran's hologram gestured toward the featureless door. You will be provided with minimal equipment consistent with basic survival needs. The scenario will continue until either you achieve a stable survival equilibrium or you become incapacitated. And by incapacitated, you mean dead, clarified Vexilloran with uncomfortable directness. Kyle blinked. Wait, this is a potentially lethal test? How is that legal under any kind of interspecies law? Your concerns about legality are noted but irrelevant. Your species has not yet been granted protection under the Galactic Covenant. The hologram flickered slightly. However, I am authorized to inform you that emergency medical intervention will occur if your vital signs indicate imminent system failure. We do not seek your death, merely accurate data. Well, that's comforting, Kyle muttered. The assessment begins in 1 standard time unit, Vexilloran stated. Approximately 6 of your Earth minutes. Use this time to prepare mentally. The door will open automatically when the assessment commences. The hologram disappeared, leaving Kyle alone in the circular room with the silent security team watching him from the entrance. Kyle took a deep breath and tried to center himself. Whatever lay beyond that door, he was now representing all of humanity in what amounted to an alien survival reality show with potentially apocalyptic consequences for Earth if he failed. No pressure. He checked what he had on him. The standard station-issued jumpsuit they'd given him, slip-on footwear that was surprisingly comfortable, but not exactly rugged, and nothing else. They'd taken his watch, his belt, even the elastic band he used to tie back his hair on occasion. Hey, he called to the security team. Any chance I could get a hint about what's on the other side of that door? Climate, terrain, hostile wildlife I should know about? The aliens remained impassively silent. Right. Wouldn't want to spoil the surprise. Kyle began stretching, limbering up for whatever physical challenges might await. As he moved, he mentally reviewed everything he knew about survival situations, his mandatory training from the space program, the wilderness survival courses he'd taken as a hobby, even the countless documentaries and shows he'd watched over the years. A soft chime sounded and the featureless door began to slide open. Showtime, Kyle whispered to himself, squaring his shoulders and stepping forward to meet whatever alien hell they'd prepared for him. The first sensation that hit Kyle as he stepped through the door was the cold, a bone-deep, breath-stealing cold that instantly made his skin prickle and his lungs burn. The second was the wind, howling across a vast, snow-covered landscape with enough force to nearly knock him off balance. The third was the realization that he was massively, catastrophically unprepared for an Arctic survival scenario. The door, sealed shut behind him with a final-sounding thud, already beginning to accumulate a coating of blowing snow. Kyle squinted against the whiteout conditions, trying to make sense of his surroundings. A few meters away, he spotted a small pile of equipment, his minimal provisions, presumably, and he staggered toward it, already feeling the cold seeping through his thin jumpsuit. The provisions turned out to be almost insultingly basic: a knife with a composite blade about 15 centimeters long, a container that appeared to be some kind of alien canteen, a small bundle of what might generously be called fabric, and a curious device that resembled a fat pen with buttons along its side. Seriously? Kyle shouted into the wind, knowing the council was monitoring him somehow. This is your idea of minimal equipment? I'll be dead in hours. No response came except the continued howling of the wind. Kyle quickly assessed his options, which were severely limited. With no proper clothing, shelter, or fire source, hypothermia would set in rapidly. His only chance was to find or create shelter immediately. He scanned the horizon, squinting through the blowing snow, and spotted what appeared to be a rocky outcropping about 100 meters away. It wasn't much, but it might provide some windbreak while he figured out his next move. Kyle gathered the meager supplies and began trudging through the snow, which was already up to his mid-calves, and made each step an effort. The wind cut through his jumpsuit as if it weren't there, and he could already feel the dangerous numbness beginning in his fingers and toes. "The Council thinks humans are dangerous," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Wait till they see how pissed off we get when we're cold." By the time he reached the rocks, Kyle's extremities were numb, and his body had begun the involuntary shivering that preceded hypothermia. The outcropping provided minimal protection from the wind, just enough to catch his breath and examine his supplies more carefully. The knife seemed sturdy enough with a slightly serrated section near the handle. The canteen contained some kind of liquid that, when he cautiously tasted a drop, seemed to be water with a mineral aftertaste. The fabric turned out to be a thin, reflective sheet, similar to an emergency blanket but barely large enough to wrap around his torso. The pen-like device was the most interesting item. After examining it for a moment, Kyle pressed one of the buttons. The end emitted a focused beam of light, not particularly bright, but definitely a directed energy source. He cycled through the buttons, discovering that one adjusted the beam's width and another its intensity. "Multi-tool," he murmured. "Might be useful if I live long enough to figure out what it does." He needed shelter immediately. The rocks provided some windbreak, but he was still exposed to the elements. Kyle examined the snowdrifts that had accumulated against the rocks and had a sudden idea, one born of desperate circumstances and half-remembered survival documentaries. Using the knife, he began to cut blocks from the densely packed snow and arrange them in a rough semicircle against the rock face. It was slow, painful work with his increasingly numb hands, but the physical activity at least generated some body heat. As he worked, he realized the alien knife was remarkably effective at cutting through the compacted snow, perhaps better than a standard earth knife would have been. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than an hour, Kyle had constructed a crude snow shelter, not a proper igloo, but a 3-walled enclosure with the rock face as the 4th wall, and a partial roof of snow blocks. He crawled inside, wrapped the reflective sheet around his upper body and huddled against the rock, trying to conserve whatever body heat he had left. "Okay, Council," he said aloud, his voice trembling from cold. "If you're watching, here's your first human survival lesson. We're stubborn as hell. It'll take more than a little snow to finish me off." As if in response to his defiance, a display panel lit up on the rock face beside him, something he hadn't noticed in his desperate shelter building. The panel showed a simple temperature readout, 40 degrees. Whether that was Celsius or Fahrenheit didn't matter. At 40 degrees the scales converged. Either way, it meant certain death without additional heat. Kyle stared at the readout, then at the pen-like device in his shaking hand, and a desperate idea began to form. Hours later, Kyle sat in the center of his significantly improved shelter, a small, steady heat source glowing in front of him. Through a combination of trial and error, reckless experimentation, and what some might call insane luck, he had discovered that the alien multi-tool could generate a sustained energy field when set to specific configurations. By embedding the device in a carefully arranged pile of snow blocks, he had created a makeshift heat exchanger that slowly melted the inner layer of snow and refroze it in a more solid configuration, all while releasing enough thermal energy to raise the temperature in his shelter to just above freezing. It wasn't comfortable by any means, but it was survivable. The reflective sheet, arranged strategically, helped direct the heat back toward him rather than losing it to the rock wall. Kyle had also managed to improve his shelter's insulation by packing additional snow around the exterior and creating a narrow, downward-sloping entrance tunnel that prevented the worst of the wind from entering. Day 1 in alien hell, Kyle narrated to his unseen watchers, his voice stronger now that he was no longer in immediate danger of freezing. "Current status, not dead yet, which I'm counting as a win." He took a careful sip from the canteen. The water had a strange aftertaste, but it seemed to be hydrating him effectively. He'd noticed that despite the extreme cold, he wasn't feeling as dehydrated as he would expect in such conditions, suggesting the liquid might contain electrolytes or other beneficial compounds. "I'm guessing the point of this little exercise is to see how quickly I give up or how resourceful I can be with minimal tools," Kyle continued, addressing the invisible monitoring systems he assumed were recording his every move. "So let me tell you a little story about humans in extreme environments." He settled back against his snow wall, conserving energy while maintaining enough movement to keep his circulation going. Humans evolved in Africa, mostly in warm climates. But we didn't stay there. We spread to every corner of Earth: Arctic tundras, scorching deserts, humid jungles, high mountain plateaus. And we didn't just survive. We created cultures and civilizations in those places. The Inuit thrived in conditions much like this, with technology no more advanced than what I've built here. Tibetan communities adapted to oxygen levels that would leave other humans gasping for air. Bedouin tribes crossed deserts that should have killed them thousands of times over. Kyle examined the multi-tool, turning it over in his hands. The difference between humans and most species isn't that we're physically superior. We're not particularly fast, strong, or well-armored compared to Earth's other predators. What makes us dangerous or successful, depending on your perspective, is that we refuse to accept environmental limitations. We don't just adapt to our environment, we adapt our environment to us. He gestured to his improvised heat source. Case in point, I'm guessing this tool wasn't designed as a heater, but that didn't stop me from repurposing it. That's what humans do. We take things designed for one purpose and find 12 other ways to use them that the original designers never imagined. The temperature readout on the wall had stabilized at just above 3 degrees, cold, but manageable. Outside, the wind continued to howl, occasionally sending gusts of snow through his entrance tunnel despite his best efforts at sealing it. So if your test is to see how dangerous I am based on my survival skills, Kyle concluded, then I should warn you, this is just the beginning. Give me a day or two, and I'll turn this frozen hellscape into a 3-bedroom apartment with indoor plumbing and a view. As darkness began to fall outside, or perhaps the simulation was simply cycling to a night phase, Kyle arranged his minimal bedding and prepared for what would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable night. Before settling in, he carefully adjusted his heat source, ensuring it would continue functioning while he slept. End of Day 1 transmission, he announced to his invisible audience. This is Kyle Matthews, Deathworlder Extraordinaire, signing off. Oh, and Council, next time you want to test a human's survival skills, maybe start with something actually challenging. This is basically camping without the s'mores. With that final act of bravado, masking his very real concerns about surviving the night, Kyle curled up in his reflective sheet and tried to sleep, one eye always on the steadily glowing heat source that stood between him and a frozen death. Kyle awoke to the sound of something large moving outside his shelter. For a moment he lay perfectly still, all his senses on high alert. The heat source was still functioning, though at a lower intensity than when he'd fallen asleep. The temperature readout on the wall showed 45 degrees, colder than yesterday, and something was definitely scraping against the outer wall of his snow shelter. Because of course there are predators, Kyle muttered, reaching for the knife. A frozen wasteland wasn't challenging enough. He crept toward the entrance tunnel, knife gripped tightly in his right hand, the multi-tool in his left. The scraping sounds continued, accompanied by what might have been breathing or wind, a rhythmic huffing that sent a primal shiver down Kyle's spine. Slowly, he peered out through the entrance tunnel. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a massive shadow moved across his limited field of vision, something large, quadrupedal, and definitely not a figment of his imagination. Kyle pulled back into his shelter, mind racing. The Council had mentioned this was a simulation, but that didn't necessarily mean the threats weren't real. For all he knew, they'd imported some actual Arctic predator from somewhere in the galaxy to see how he'd react. The scraping grew more insistent, and small chunks of snow began to fall from the roof of his shelter. Whatever was out there, it was trying to dig its way in. Or at least that's what it sounded like. Kyle weighed his options. He could stay put and hope the creature lost interest, but if it collapsed his shelter, he'd be exposed to both the predator and the lethal cold. He could try to drive it away, but that would mean exposing himself and potentially triggering a predatory response. Or he could try to kill it, which might solve both his predator problem and his food problem in one stroke. Option 3 it is, Kyle whispered, adjusting the settings on the multi-tool. If it could generate enough heat to keep him alive overnight, Perhaps at maximum settings it could serve as a rudimentary weapon. The scraping suddenly stopped. Kyle held his breath, straining to hear over the constant background howl of the wind. For several long moments there was nothing. Then, without warning, a massive force struck the side of his shelter, sending snow blocks tumbling and creating a gaping hole in his carefully constructed wall. Through the opening, Kyle caught a glimpse of his attacker, a creature that resembled a cross between a polar bear and a